Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. When Games for Change reached out to me about speaking here, I was asked to talk about the state of the games industry. And I thought, what can I possibly say about the state of the games industry in, a 30-minute talk when that's a topic that people much smarter than me have written entire books about. So I'm going to try to give you a big picture look at the state of the games industry as I see it through the lens of my own experience. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the systemic problems that I see in the industry and how I think we can make the most of this exciting transitional period in games that we're in the midst of right now. So let me tell you a bit about who I am, because my identity and my experiences really inform my perspective on the industry. And I hope that my rather somewhat unusual experiences can be valuable and illuminating to others. So yes, I'm Carolyn Petit, and currently I'm the managing editor. Is this working? Yes, I'm the managing editor for Feminist Frequency. Feminist Frequency is an organization that produces critiques of pop culture from a feminist perspective. You may have heard of our Tropes versus Women in Video Games series, where we look at some of the larger patterns of how women have been represented in games throughout game history. The ubiquitous use of the damsel in distress trope, for instance, or the frequent use of female characters as kind of sexualized rewards for player achievement. These kinds of patterns, and how they reinforce attitudes about women that exist in our patriarchal society. But it's the experiences I had that led me to this position that really shaped a lot of how I think about games. So let me go back in time a bit. Like a lot of us, I imagine, I grew up with games. I remember holding the cartridge for Pitfall for the Atari 2600 as a kid and looking at it and wondering how this person, David Crane, whose name was on the cartridge like the author of a book, how had he created this world that appeared on my family's television set that I could enter and explore. It was really, truly like magic to me, and I never stopped wanting to explore those worlds. And back then, I already thought of myself as being someone like this. That's from Wreck-It Ralph, a gamer girl at the arcade. But, importantly for what I'm going to talk about today, in the world itself, to other people, I was perceived a lot more like one of these folks.
You see the latest Nintendo newsletter?
Whoa, nice graphics. I'd like to get my hands on that game.
You mean you haven't played it yet? We can play it on my Nintendo Entertainment System. It's The Legend of Zelda, and it's really rad. Those creatures from Ganon are pretty bad. Octoroks, Tektites, Levers, too. But with your help, our hero pulls through. Yeah, go Link, yeah, get some.
Awesome.
Intense.
The Nintendo Entertainment System. Your parents help you hook it up. The Legend of Zelda sold separate.
Yeah, go Link, get some. So interestingly, the Nintendo Entertainment System and the games associated with it marked a significant shift in games marketing and advertising. If you look back at Atari-era advertisements, you see a lot of families, you see a lot of moms and daughters playing as well as dads and sons. But, one great Atari-era commercial was about this grandmother who was obsessed with the game Berserk. When the NES came along, to distance itself from the video game industry crash that had occurred a few years prior, it came with Rob, your robotic operating buddy, and it was marketed not as a game but as a toy for boys. And that's a shift that in some ways, the industry may not yet have fully recovered from. So for many years, I participated in video game culture being perceived by most people as a straight white male. And I have to tell you, I found games culture really, really welcoming. Games were something I could share with my friends or use to connect with people I didn't really know. And I was always totally treated with respect when I went to game stores. Nobody ever suspected that I wasn't a real gamer or that I had to be shopping for someone else or anything like that. And because that was my perspective and my experience, on some level, I assumed that games culture would be really welcoming to anyone who might want to participate. Yeah, so let me flash forward many years. It's 2010, And after struggling with intense feelings of gender dysphoria for many, many years, I'm transitioning to living as my true self. And as this is happening, I'm also hired by GameSpot, one of the oldest and most established sites covering video games. And of course, I'm not so naive as to think that my being a transgender woman will have no impact whatsoever on how I'm received by the GameSpot community. I know that I'm in some ways forging ahead into unknown territory. But there's a difference between speculating about what it might be like and actually living it. And when I first appear on camera for GameSpot, there are numerous comments on that first video that express this basic sentiment of that GameSpot's customer base is straight males, and that we, the straight male customer base, the people leaving these comments, want women who are appealing to us. And by hiring women where it's clear that that wasn't the most important factor in the decision-making process, like whether they're going to be appealing to us, the straight male audience, that GameSpot was kind of defying its customer base. And I'm certainly not saying at all that all gamers possess that attitude, not remotely. But among a not insignificant number, there was this level of entitlement that they felt, that in terms of how women appeared in their media, they could kind of make these demands, that women weren't there primarily for whatever perspective they might bring or for their knowledge. Women were there, at least in part, to be like visually appealing. And, pow. For me, this was kind of like being struck by lightning. This was the M. Night Shyamalan plot twist moment that changed my perspective on everything that had come before, on all my experiences with games culture. Immediately I was able to start seeing how these attitudes did not simply come to fruition in some kind of vacuum. They didn't just evolve free of any kind of cultural influence or reinforcement. These attitudes were, to a significant degree, cultivated and reinforced by the games industry, unfortunately. And I became fascinated with how the industry was at times perpetuating that culture. Because once you see it, you can also start to figure out how to challenge and disrupt these cycles and trends. I wondered, how did we arrive at this point? What is it about the games industry that has led some people to feel so strongly as if it belongs to them to the exclusion of others? Okay, so here at Games for Change, there's a lot of excitement about the potential of games to open up new frontiers of human experience, to educate and inspire, and that is wonderful. That is a huge part of why I love games and why games are so exciting. But if we're going to make the most of our efforts to maximize the good that games can do, in addition to supporting and celebrating those wonderful things, we also have to acknowledge the way that games can and sometimes do reinforce some things that aren't so worthy of celebration. So yeah, an important concept here at Games for Change is the concept of impact. What impact are games having? And when we talk about positive impact, it's often visible. It's represented by changes in behavior, a noticeable development of awareness. But if we're going to seize this exciting transitional moment that games are in right now, we also need to be aware of the much less visible impact of all these forces that work to reinforce the status quo, and how the choices we ourselves make can either contribute to those forces or challenge them. Yet another standard military shooter with a white male protagonist on the market may not have much discernible impact because it just reinforces the way things already are. But the sum total of all those military shooters with white male protagonists definitely has an impact in establishing and maintaining cultural norms. So when I say the games industry, what do I mean? I don't just mean the games themselves or the content of the game, so that's absolutely a huge part of it. Culturally speaking, the games industry is a complex assortment of interwoven elements that can all work to reinforce each other's dominant values or to challenge them or subvert them. So in addition to the games themselves, it's also the advertising that promotes those games. That can definitely work to reinforce ideas about who games are for and where women or marginalized folks, fit into that. So one of my favorite game ads, for instance, is an old magazine ad for the game Gauntlet Dark Legacy. And I couldn't find a high-resolution image of the ad, so you'll have to take my word for it. But I swear to you that this ad exists. And it shows the four characters, the sorceress, the knight, the dwarf, and the jester. And the text, reads, the game where you and three buddies all get to be heroes. Only thing is, one of you has to be the chick. And just to give it that nice little extra bit of je ne sais quoi, One of the players is saying to his poor buddy who has to play as the female character, "Nice rack." Yeah. Now, of course, again, I'm not saying that these attitudes are endemic to games culture, not remotely. The idea that there's something deeply shameful about femaleness or that femaleness is inherently beneath men and maleness is an ill that runs throughout our society, and it has tremendous consequences. But ads like this definitely can work to amplify those sentiments within gamer culture and to sell to men not just the games, but a feel-good validation of their cultural dominance relative to women. Now, that particular ad obviously was an extreme example, and it's not always that overt, but the ideas that ad traffics in are commonplace and have long been treated as perfectly normal and acceptable. You know, and once you're made aware of how video game ads can work to reinforce the ideas that games and games culture are predominantly for men and that women in these spaces are to be more valued as sex objects than as full human beings, you start to see it in so much video game advertising. And when I say the games industry, I also mean the websites that cover games. This is GamePro had this great rating system where like faces with differing amounts of enthusiasm were like the score. I used to love that. So when I say the games industry, I also mean the websites that cover games and the culture that they foster in their comments sections and online communities. As I mentioned, you know, working at GameSpot as a transgender woman, I received no small amount of hostility from some members of the community. I also had a lot of wonderful fans and supporters. But the truth was that in some ways, the version of the games industry that GameSpot presented to its readers made them feel as if these attitudes were normal and justified and okay. Because the important thing is that game sites do not just cover games culture. In the act of covering the games industry and the culture around the games industry, they inevitably, to some degree, create that culture and shape it. That's an impact and a responsibility that some games writers don't really want to acknowledge, but it's true. So last month, there was an interview on the Huffington Post with the great trans male writer and advocate for trans visibility, Teek Milan. And he wasn't talking about games specifically, but he was talking about pop culture, but his words were so apt for the conversation happening, I think, around games culture right now. He said, as a journalist, what I believe is that we don't only document the culture, we create the culture. We're kind of setting the pace for what's cool, what's not, what's inclusive, what's not. Pop culture does that. So those who are responsible for being the people who are on the pulse of change, it's important that there's inclusivity and that there's visibility of all different kinds of people, because that is what changes the world. And you know, games culture, games coverage, rather, is getting a lot better in this regard. But there is still so much work to do. You know, I can tell you, I had tremendous support from my colleagues at GameSpot, but there was a reluctance at times among some to run news stories that were focused on issues of representation or sexism, or that centered the experiences of women, out of fear that these stories would alienate our core readers. And by not telling our core readers these stories that might complicate their own relationship with gaming culture and their feelings of ownership of that culture, we were in effect presenting them with a comforting, reassuring version of games culture that reinforced those feelings of entitlement. That was the culture that we were making. And that is journalistically irresponsible, right? Comforting and validating the feelings of core readers can come at the expense of acknowledging systemic problems and representing the experiences of those who aren't considered the core. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. You're not just catering to the core. Consciously or not, you are working to determine who belongs in the core and who doesn't. So now let's talk about the games themselves. I'm going to talk primarily about two big recent games that I think are emblematic of the moment in which games culture finds itself. Now, I hardly think the AAA games are more valid or more worthy of discussion than indie games or other releases, but you know, my time is limited, and these just happen to be two games that I think in a lot of ways symbolize and encapsulate where we are as a culture, how far we've come, and how much more there remains for us to do. Last month, Uncharted 4 was released, and this is the latest and last chapter in a blockbuster series of action-adventure games featuring this guy, Nathan Drake. And, again, while you can't lay the blame on any one game for creating the status quo in the gaming industry that says that the standard hero, and by extension the standard type of human being, is the white male, we can say that each game that comes out that features yet another white male protagonist plays some small part in reinforcing that status quo. And like the other things I've discussed, this is a systemic issue. Some of you may have seen these news stories recently about how Microsoft refused to put a black woman on the cover of Fable 2, insisting that it be yet another white male on the cover of the game. Some may say, well, that was 8 years ago. But, if we're being real, among the games with the biggest budgets and the biggest ad campaigns, and that therefore in some ways have the greatest kind of cultural reach, white men are still, overwhelmingly centered. And as a result, games which have a tremendous capacity to foster empathy and to enable us to see the humanity in others sure let most of us empathize with white men a whole lot and see their experiences as universal. But they don't do as much as they could to encourage all of us to project ourselves onto and see the humanity in other folks. To use an example from just last week, at E3, the gaming industry's biggest annual event, it was revealed that in the upcoming Legend of Zelda game, the latest in the series that we saw an ad for the first entry in the upcoming Legend of Zelda game, you will not have the option to play as a female hero. There have been rumors and speculation and some excitement about the possibility that maybe you'd have the option to play as a female hero this time, and it came out that that wasn't going to be the case. And it was disappointing for some, myself included. And when I expressed that disappointment on Twitter, I got a response that said that I and people like me would not be happy until every game let you play as, and I quote, as a gay black Muslim woman. And that is, interestingly, really tellingly, that is almost always the example, because that is not the first time I've heard that. And it is almost always a gay black Muslim woman or a transgender black Muslim woman or something along those lines. Why? Because that is the farthest thing that people making this argument can come up with for what has been established and reinforced for them as the default human, the straight, white, cisgender male. And so there's a real value judgment there of intrinsic humanity. Who is worthy of being who is worthy of being represented? Who is worthy of us projecting ourselves onto? And of course, in actuality, a straight, white, cisgender male is no more default and no more human than a gay black woman. But games have helped to, unfortunately, to reinforce this notion of white male as default. But, the good news is that, of course, they can also help to tear it down. Often, when women are featured, they're presented to one degree or another as objects of sexual desire for male players, rather than being allowed to simply and fully be human beings, the way that so many male characters in games are, which brings me to the other, big game du jour, Overwatch. This is a game that, when it was first announced, the developer Blizzard revealed 5 female heroes, all of whom had the standard slender body type that women in games overwhelmingly have. And most of those 5 women were dressed in outfits that were at least somewhat sexualizing. And contrasting, those characters, we can contrast those characters with the male heroes who were also announced at that time, who reflected a tremendous assortment of body types. And, when you do that, you start to glimpse an issue that is prevalent in games, where men often can be tall or short, slender or fat, but women are overwhelmingly drawn from the same template because so many designers have learned to design games and game characters primarily to be appealing to straight male players, and that comes at a cost. However, since then, Blizzard has introduced a few new female heroes to Overwatch who have different body types. And Uncharted 4, spoilers, ends with an epilogue in which you play as Nathan's teenage daughter, Cassie. And it really feels to me like this symbolic representation of where games culture is right now in a lot of ways. This kind of awkward adolescent phase, perhaps not so dominated by violent white men, but still with all this uncertainty about just what the future holds. It's up to us now to decide what kind of industry we want to be. And these gestures are very welcome, but they also, to me, in some ways feel small. They're like we're not willing to really rock the boat. Like we're trying to right the ship really slowly so as to not risk upsetting those people who feel such an entitled ownership to games that they feel threatened by the idea of a more diverse and inclusive culture. And I admit, I want to see bigger change take place. Because if games have the power to contribute to it and reinforce a particular culture, then of course they also have the power to challenge and dismantle it. And for that, awareness and critical thinking are essential. When we think about these things, when we perceive them, we can interrupt these patterns and disrupt the cycle. So, if you're in games marketing or PR, consider whether the way you're presenting the game reinforces the idea of games as something that's predominantly for straight men. Who are you targeting with your game marketing, and why? And in how you target the people you do target, what are you saying about the people you may not be targeting? If you write about the games industry, do you do it in a way that subtly implies that games culture exists for some people to the exclusion of others? Are you worried about alienating core readers by acknowledging the cultural complexities of the moment? If you are, you might find yourself looking increasingly irrelevant because games writing and games culture is becoming more diverse. The answer is not to double down on appealing specifically to straight male readers. Rather, it's to broaden our ideas of who games and games coverage can be for. And of course, if you design games, just take little moments throughout the design process, have those conversations in your studio where you challenge the conventional wisdom and the base assumptions, even if just for a moment. In both the big budget spaces and the indie spaces, some of the most exciting stuff happening in games right now is stuff that challenges our conventional ideas about what games can be, who games can be about, and what kinds of stories games can tell, and even how games can focus on cooperation instead of violence. It's a volatile time, but it's also a really exciting time. From Pitfall way back in 1982 to the wonderful Kentucky Route Zero today, games have given me magical worlds to explore, to be part of games, to be creating them or shaping the culture by writing about them, or even to be in marketing and to be trying to reach people and bring them to your game. All of these things are a privilege and a responsibility. And when games represent more people, and when they speak to more people, when they're relevant to the lives of more people, and when they're more diverse and innovative, and they take more risks, and the idea of them being predominantly the realm of straight males to the exclusion of others just doesn't have a leg to stand on anymore, it's better for all of us. Thank you.